Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch, and in this video we're going to explore Swift dates and how you can format dates as strings for presentation in your Swift/SwiftUI projects. We'll look at the DateFormatter class and the dateStyle and timeStyle properties. We'll follow that by using fixed format date representations using a format string. In iOS 14 with SwiftUI, we got an easier way to display dates in text views, so we'll explore the formatter initializer that was introduced here. And then in iOS 15, it was expanded even more so that we can now use static dateTime of the DateFormatStyle structure and the format initializer for a text view. There's a lot to cover, so if this is what you want to learn, then keep watching. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. I have a starter set of playground pages that I created for this video, and I encourage you to download it from the link in the description and work along with me, because once completed, you'll have something that you can refer back to in the future. Now, if you're not seeing this rendered markup, and it looks like this, be sure to set the option from the editor menu as described, and it'll make navigation between pages much easier. So let's get started. On this first page, we're going to take a look at how we can use a DateFormatter class to stylize and print out our dates to the console in the playground. Now, the first thing that we need is a date to work with. In Swift, when you create a new instance of a date object, it'll use the current date and time as derived from your system. To make this a little clearer, we can use the now static property to represent the same thing. A date object is more than just a date and time. It represents a specific point in time, and it knows its specific position in the time continuum using January 1st, 1970 as a reference date. It also knows the time zone that is used, as well as a number of other useful properties. So when we print out the date, we have to be very specific as to what we want to use from that object. So to do this, we can use a DateFormatter class that will allow us to convert between dates and their textual representations. You can create an instance of that class. So we'll call ours DateFormatter, and it'll be an instance of that DateFormatter class. As I said, the class has a number of useful properties that we can set according to our particular needs, and one of them is dateStyle. Now, dateStyle itself is an enum with a number of different options that we can explore, and you can see when you start by typing a period. So for reference then, let's see what they all give us. So let's first start with full. Then to print out the date, we use the DateFormatter's string method from a given date, and our date is that current date and time that we created. When I execute the playground, I see that I get a pretty standard date presentation in the console. No time, just the date, and the presentation is based on the locale of my system, so you may see something different. I'm going to duplicate these two lines and display the other options. So to distinguish them between one another in the console, let me first add a string as the first argument for the print that says .full, and then use a comma to separate the arguments. Now, if I select these two lines and use a Command D, I can duplicate them 4 more times and change my format to a different date style, from full to cover all the 5 options, and then change the label as well. So I'll make sure that I include the short, medium, long, and none options as well. When I print now, I get a good reference and I can see which of the different enum options I'm presenting. In addition to dateStyle, there's timeStyle. So I want to get a reference for each one of them as well. Now, because this code block is in a closure, I'll need to create another instance of DateFormatter in here. And this time I'm going to apply the timeStyle property. And I could set it to full, but you can see here that I have the same 5 options here as I had for dateStyle. So to speed things up, let me just copy the code from the previous example and paste it in here. And now I can double click to select dateStyle and then use Option Command E each time, and it'll select the next case of that string in that closure. And then I can simply type timeStyle to replace them all at once. Executing the playground now, I see now my reference for timeStyle is here too. Nice. Of course, sometimes we want to display both date and time. So we can choose which of the different date styles or time styles we want. So, for example, date style of long and a time style of short. So again, we'll create an instance of the DateFormatter object. And then we can specify our two style properties, one for date style and one for time style. And then print them out using that strings from current date and time method. I mentioned earlier that you may not be seeing the same presentation because you may be in a different locale that uses a different date and time format. And that format's derived from your current system settings on your device. Well, you can override that by specifying a different locale, for example, French. I can copy the same code from the previous example. But before I print it out, I can specify a locale that requires a locale object. And we can use the initializer that requires an identifier. And you'll see shortly what all of those identifiers could be. But I know that the identifier for France is the lowercase fr with an underscore followed by the uppercase fr. Now we can print it out. And you can see how a Frenchman would specify the date. To finish off this section then, you may have already realized this, but if you only want to display a date or a time, you only need to specify a single style format. There's no need to use that none option for the other style. So to display the current time for your locale, I'll just need to create a date formatter and specify the time style only. So let me just copy the code from our previous example and remove the date style. And you see when you print it out using the DateFormatter's string from method, you only get the time. Sometimes you need to define a format that can't be achieved using the predefined styles. We can do that with a fixed format date representation. So let's check that out here on this second page. At the top of this page, I have a date object as before called current date and time, and it will use that date at the time that the instance is created. There are also two sample strings that represent two different ways to represent a date as a string. And you may or may not be able to construct these representations from the dateStyle and timeStyle properties that we used on the DateFormatter in the last page. However, what we're going to explore now is a way to construct our dates and display them basically any way we like. In the first example, let's create an instance of the DateFormatter class as before. But this time, instead of using a date or time style, I want to use the dateFormat property, and you see that it will require a format that we can use to represent a date in any style we like in our two examples above, which are strings. So how do we find out how to create this string? Well, it turns out that this site that's maintained by Ben Shearman is the Bible on this topic. When you visit the site, you see that there are all sorts of examples displaying the format text and the current dates representation in that format. And there's also a reference section for you and a set of best practices. Well, in this section, you can modify the format text, and then you can see what it's going to look like. Well, looking at my sample date and the result displayed, this is almost exactly what I want here, but I'm missing the time. Well, if I look down at the examples, it looks like this time is exactly what I want. The hour will be displayed using 1 or 2 digits, and always 2 digits for minutes, followed by either AM or PM, so that I can copy this then and paste it into the example generator at the top. And as I refresh the presentation, I see that this looks pretty much what I want. It's just using a different date. Well, if I wanted to see what this looks like in a different locale, as I saw on the last page, I could choose the locale from here. And here's where I can see all of those different identifiers that I can determine which one I want. So before we do that though, let's just copy that string and use it in one of my examples. Then, as before, I can print the string method on our date formatter for our current date and time. So let's go back then and check out the different locales. So first, let me copy that last example and paste it in here. Before I print it, however, I want to set the date formatter locale. And as you know, this requires a locale instance that needs an identifier. So again, if I return to that NSDateFormatter site, I can search for the one that I want. And since I live in Canada and we have 2 official languages, I want to see what it would look like in French Canada. And I can see that this locale is lowercase fr underscore capital CA. So let me just use that as my identifier. Now I can run this code, and when it prints out, I can see the comparison between the system default, which is likely US in my case, and French Canada. Now, you may be getting dates stored in some database that may have been stored as strings. And if you want to do any date calculations or display the dates differently in your views, you need to convert those strings to date objects. And this is the reverse process to what we just did. For example, consider this date string from my top set of examples. If I can find a format that matches this presentation, I can convert it from this string representation to an actual date object. So I'll start by creating a date formatter as before, and then we'll need to specify the date formatter's date format string. So let me bring back that website again and look at my date string. I see that the month is 2 digits followed by a dash. The day is 2 digits, a dash, followed by the year, which is 4 digits. And then after that, I see that we have the time, but this is a 24-hour clock, no AM or PM. So I could refer to the examples here and the reference if necessary and construct my string to represent that. And what I've discovered, it's capital MM dash lowercase dd dash lowercase YYYY, uppercase HH for hours, lowercase mm for minutes. So I'm going to use that, and I'll copy it and use it as my string. Next then, I'll use the date formatter's date method to construct a new date from that string. If I choose just to print the date, though, without specifying any format, the playground will choose its own default presentation. But the date method returns an optional value, so I'll need to provide a fallback in case it's not valid. Now when I print, I see the default representation. I only used my date formatter to convert from that string to a date, but when I printed it out to the console, I'm using the default format. It's not too difficult to see, though, that this is February 18th, 2020, as my string showed, but the time is being displayed as 16:03, which is 4:03 p.m. for those in North America, instead of 8:03 a.m. Well, why is that? Well, by default, a date object in Swift represents a point in time in UTC, the Coordinated Universal Time, or GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. So we need to specify our locale and set the time zone to UTC. And what the documentation indicates is that you should be using a POSIX locale. Well, for most fixed formats, you should also set the locale property to a POSIX locale. And in this case, in the US, it would be en_US_POSIX. And set the time zone property to UTC. So let's copy and paste the example from the previous one then, and we can paste it in here and add 2 more DateFormatter properties before we print. First, let's add the locale. I'll return to the website there, and I see that what Ben has set for the default is the one that I want, the en_US_POSIX. And then, as the documentation recommends, we'll set the time zone property to UTC. And now, when I print this out, I see that the 803 is what I want. In SwiftUI, we can display dates as strings inside of text views. And in this section and in the next, I want to show you how SwiftUI is evolving and how we now have many different options. This page is a playground page that will display a preview when we run it. The content is just a number of labeled content views with a form so that we can see what our representations are. And I grouped this section here because I would have exceeded the maximum 10 views inside a form. So let's start by creating a date property that can update via this button and set it initially to the current date. And then this has to be a state property. So when the view gets changed, this property gets set, but it doesn't update unless the view gets updated. And I want to update it by way of that button. So let me just set the action on this button to do that. Let's start with an old method for doing this. We'll need a date formatter, so we can create that as a computed property. And then within the body of this, I can create a new instance of a date formatter, and then assign a date style and a time style of my choice, and return that fully formed date formatter that I'll be able to use in my code. Now let me create a second date formatter that will use a date format string. So I'll do that the same way as the first, but I'll just specify a format string like mm-dd-yyyy and make sure I return that date formatter. So now I have 2 date formatters that I can choose to display my dates in text views. And we'll get to that shortly, but first let me show you what happens if I just use string interpolation within a text view to display the date as a string and not use any date formatter at all. I can execute the playground, but I find often that my preview doesn't display unless I tap on one of these to force it. This may just be my ignorance, but it works for me. You see that the date displayed gives me lots of information, not at all similar to how it was displayed in the console in the previous page when we didn't display a format. This isn't what I want, so let me explore some other options. Well, we could use a date formatter to create a string representation. So let's choose the first date formatter to create a date string from the current date and time. And we know how to do that. We use the date formatter string from the current date and time method. And then when I display a text view using that date string and refresh my preview, I can see that I get what I expected. Well, iOS 14 has made this much easier for us. There is now a new initializer for a text view that allows us to specify the formatter as an argument. So we no longer need to create that instance of a string or date string. We can go right to creating a text view for our date, but add the formatter argument and choose the one that we want. So we'll choose the same date formatter. And we see that it gives us exactly the same presentation. But wait, it gets even better. iOS 14 introduced another text option, which is style. So let's check that out. You can see that there are 5 different choices, so let's see what they do, just like we did on our first page, starting this time with date. That's pretty straightforward. What about time? That's expected. Now, note that the format used is the format specified by my system, so you may be seeing something different. Let's see what timer does. Well, that's very interesting. It starts a counter starting from the time that the view or the date was created, and this might come in handy. Let's check out the relative option. Well, now we're actually getting the seconds string included. In this group section, I want to explore the final style, which is offset. So first, let me create a date string using the DateFormatter 2 this time that I've defined, where I specify the month, day, and year. I'm going to create one then for Christmas of this year, which is 12/25/2023. So I can now represent this in a text view displaying Christmas, but I'm going to choose the style of offset. Now, before I run it, you'll see that I'm told that date is optional, so I'll need to unwrap it if I'm going to use it. So you can see that at the time of creation of this video, when I run this project, Christmas is 8 months away. Well, let me choose another date, and I'm going to create one for tomorrow, which in my case was April 7th, 2023. So again, to display it, I'll use a text view with the style of offset. And if I run this now, you see what happens if I don't unwrap that date I constructed. So let me fix that. The offset is now showing us hours. Let me do one more. I'm going to create another date that's just 59 seconds from now. And I can do that using the dates adding time interval method. And I'll specify 59 seconds. There's no need to unwrap this because it's being very specific using a guaranteed date. Again, I'll use the style of offset. Well, now you actually see that date time counting down in seconds. And then if I tap this reset date button, that current date gets reset and the date now gets updated and the countdown starts all over again, as do the offsets. This could come in very handy. On this final page, I'll show you that in iOS 15, we got even more options. So to save some time, I'm using the same date formatters and the date property here. We've seen a text view that has a formatter and style initializer. And in iOS 16, we're given a format option for the text view. This allows us to use a Date.formatStyle. Let's explore this with the dateTime option. When we display a text view, I see that we get a pretty standard shortened display of the date and a time. Well, what we can do is add more to this format by extending this to include a number of other properties. For example, I could display the weekday. And you can see all these different options when we type a period. So I'm going to leave it up to you to explore many of them on your own, but let's just check some of them out now and see what they mean. Most you see have optional format properties, but let's just leave them now and just choose these ones. A month, day, year, week, hour, minute, and second. Pretty standard. The only one I'm not too sure of is that week. Now when I display this in my text view, I see that oddball one, which is the week, and this is the week number in the year. So currently, I'm in the 14th week of this year. And you can get this information from the date components as well. Now, if we want to explore some of the different format options for each of these, let's do that. So I'm going to use the same as above, but leave out the week and seconds. When I choose weekday or any one of these, I can hold down the Option key on the keyboard and see that the format option's highlighted. And this is an enum, so that I can just simply enter a period and see my options. So let's choose wide. So for month, I'm going to choose exactly the same option, wide. For day, I want it to be printed using 2 digits. I'll leave the year, hour, and minute the same. But again, I encourage you to try the different enum options yourself to see how they display. When I update my preview, it shows me the results. Now, just for some exploration, let's take a look at a couple of those other special options. I'm going to choose week, but I'm going to specify week of month. And for day, I'm going to choose ordinal of day and month, whatever that means. Well, when I print this out, I'm going to bring up a calendar here. And what it's telling me is that I am in the second week of the month of April, because the 1st of April was last Saturday. And the weekday of the month, which was a Thursday, it's telling me that this Thursday is the first Thursday of the month of April. Very interesting, but not too practical for display purposes. And finally, let me specify format again on the current date and time in this example. But this time I'm going to choose the actual Date.formatStyle. And then, as you can see here, I can choose a number of different options here. But what I'm going to choose are date and time. And for the date, I can just simply choose complete. And for time, I could choose whatever I want, but I'm just going to specify none, which is likely redundant. And this gives me the complete date. Wow. Well, as you can see, there are a mind-boggling number of options to choose from when displaying dates in Swift. This is a rather long video. I'm going to leave it up to you now to explore more in detail, but at least I hope that I've been able to show you the different possibilities. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into date formatting, and if you have, please give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment. This helps drive more traffic to my channel and encourages me to continue on creating these. Thanks for watching.